um, introduce you. Julian, thank you very much for co-hosting this, and over to you to manage that part of the process.
Okay, wish me luck. Here we go with a short YouTube 6-minute clip.
I worked all over the world, working mainly on water, soils, desertification, reclamation, and sustainable development. I began to watch a growing panic spread through the media and through government that there was a global crisis at hand, pushing up temperatures to such a degree that it would have catastrophic effects. I was a little bit skeptical, so I began to examine global warming caused by CO2. I noticed that there was a relation between temperatures at ground and air level, the water concentration, and
Seem to have lost the sound here.
Was
life of the soil. And the carbon is then left exposed and will actually oxidize away longer hold water. So if it rains, the water runs off carrying the soil with it. The soil beneath is panned and therefore the water cannot go into the aquifer. When the sun hits the soil, then you have a temperature rise, and you can feel that when you walk outside on any sunny day. When the temperature rises in soil, the moisture evaporates and it takes the heat with it. So farmland, which is regenerative farmland, which has high carbon soil, will remain cool. Soil which has been given over to modern agriculture, lacking carbon, lacking moisture, will get very hot. The equations are almost hidden away in books, but you can look up the Penman equations. You can calculate the difference between a wet soil and a dry soil, and you can actually see that the dry soil will give you a big temperature difference on the land and in the air. Similarly, in cities, where we have a high temperature rise because concrete absorbs heat and has no moisture to evaporate it away. So we're creating urban heat islands with cities, and we're creating agricultural heat islands by the way that we treat soil. In the summer of 2022, we saw quite a lot of interesting features, such as fires in forests, drying out of soil so the farmers could not actually harvest their crops. In Europe, it was the worst drought in 500 years, and it spread all across Europe. So hydropower went down, the nuclear power went down because of lack of cooling water, and there was crop failure throughout Europe. And so the potential for disaster, because of the water cycle that is being disrupted, is enormous. My position is quite simple. The emissions that are causing the damage are coming from agriculture, the industrialized form of agriculture where CO2 is being lost from the soil. And as a consequence of that loss, the soil cannot hold water and it is running off the land is drying out and the temperatures are going up. And all of this is a result of government policy driven by the large agricultural conglomerates. You need to help nature put the carbon back into the soil by rebuilding the bacterial structure of the soil. If you do that, that soil can once again act like a sponge and absorb water. What is happening now is that these things are just being done willy-nilly with no discussion. And so this book is an attempt to redress that a little bit and to perhaps start the discussion going again, because the majority of people, I feel, do not just accept a very unscientific declaration that we must have net zero. The book was necessary to counter the complete closing off of scientific discussion. Control of our resources must go back into the community. You cannot keep charging more and more for water services, for sewage, and closing down energy systems without proper discussion and without allowing the communities to take control of what is fundamentally their assets.
Okay, apologies for muting at this end. I don't think you missed too much. I didn't realize it was going to knock on to the show.
No problem.
Okay, Lucian, it's your show. Do you want to pause to say anything, or do you want to go straight into the presentation?
Well, I've done my bit. I'll go and have some tea.
Yeah, well, you have really.
No. Yeah, we can go straight on if you like. And,
Okay.
Talk about it.
Well, here we are. Just prompt me when you want to change the slide.
Okay. Just a bit of intro. I'm on my way to 79 now, I think. When I first left school, I went into what was in the gas industry, coal gas industry. And I got my first degrees there in engineering, chemistry, and physics. And we were making town gas from coal. We had standby emergency startup units if we were running short of gas. And all in all, the very efficient operation of the nationalised industry went on for a goodly time. My last job was to bring in North Sea gas onshore. And the chairman of the gas board came to see us all. It was publicly owned. And he asked all the engineers and chemists to stay with it and get the North Sea gas on shore. And he told us that it was 1 shilling and 3pence a therm in old money. And once we had brought it on shore, it would drop within 5 years to 1 old penny a therm, because it was publicly owned gas. And he actually meant that. 5 years later on, of course, we had the big asset stream going on, and fuel poverty is now one of the major causes of problems in the country. And I've seen that pattern in nearly everything. I've worked in water, I've worked in agriculture, I've worked all over the world, and the politicians will tell you anything. What actually comes out at the other end is that none of it works. We've got monopoly situations, and those monopolies themselves are controlled and publicized by sort of fake media. So if we move on from there, Julian, to the next one. Thanks. I began looking at this when I retired. I worked in northern China at minus 32 degrees. I've worked in Sudan at plus 50 degrees. And so I've seen ecosystems at all of the extremes, and I've worked with the soil. And I was very surprised when they started talking about this curve that came up that said, oh my word, the CO2 is going up and it's dragging the temperature up, and we're in for a climate crisis. And when I looked at that, I thought, well, maybe, but the temperature rise, well, and the CO2 rise, maybe, given what's been happening over the centuries. And the other thing that happened was that the graph, when they originally showed it, the CO2, somebody pointed out, was following the rise in temperature, which was the wrong way around. And it was a correlation. It was not proof, but it was being taken as proof. But if your temperature was going up first and CO2 was following, then that was the wrong way around from what they were saying. So I looked at the book of physics from the ILPC, and they talked about the infrared. I did physics and infrared. And the chap who spotted the fact that CO2 was increasing put forward the idea, it was just an idea, and we can discuss them, that it was CO2, because of its effect on infrared, that was causing the greenhouse effect. So I started to look at that, because I'd done infrared for 7 years, and yes, sort of CO2 absorbs, but water is by far the biggest absorbent. And so I looked at it. If you look at the next slide, thanks, I got these figures. And these are not mine, they're from the various agencies that I quoted there, with forest fires, range mowers, grazing cattle, agriculture, fossil fuel, and so on. And here we have about 60 BT per annum release from these different sectors. And this is not all of the sectors. You've got a big release from marine gas release on the seabed and things like that. So, but what I did, I totaled this up to maybe 100%. And what I noticed was that fossil fuels in agriculture were bigger than, were smaller than the total release from agriculture. So I thought, well, if you're going to claim that CO2 from fossil fuels is the target, why? Because much, much more is being released from our ecosystems. So why should we say that the correlation between fossil fuels and CO2 is causing the agricultural problems, the weather instability? I also thought, why should we be getting such a big release from agriculture? And then it dawned on me, having worked in Sudan and China and places, that the more we loaded up the ground with fertilizer, the more CO2 we were getting. And the more spraying we did with pesticides and herbicides, again, more CO2. And the reason for that was that the soil structure is made up of clays and organic matter, humic material and sand. And if you open the soil up and it dries out, then you get oxidation of the carbon, the humic material, and that is what's happening. The reason that follows from that is that water is held in the soil by the humic matter, and if the humic matter is destroyed, it simply cannot hold water. You can get some water held in clay. It's very good at absorbing water, but by applying fertilizer and ammonia, the ammonia will attack clay, which is a three-dimensional crystal, and it replaces some of the ions that are in the crystal structure. The ammonia goes in, the ions comes out, and eventually the three-dimensional structure of the clay collapses to a two-dimensional plate. And when that happens, the permeability drops. The water can't get through. So we had a long, long period of ammonia being applied to land all over the planet, and without realizing that too much fertilizer damages the soil structure, and then much more recently, a very rapid destruction of the soil by glyphosate and things like that, which kills the organic bacteria and life forms in the soil and renders it completely inert. When it's inert, you have no water holding. So next one, Julian, please. So I then looked at a correlation between the land areas of the planet and the agricultural spread through the years. And this is a graph that I came up with. And it's actually a better fit if we're talking about correlation. And correlation is only a link, it's not a proof. But the temperature and CO2 rises follows much more clearly to the increase in agriculture and the emissions from land area in Oceania, Australia, Southern Africa, China, rest of Asia. And I actually put the facetious down there. If reparation for carbon dioxide emissions is due to industrial revolution, should we not be charging the industrial West or the agricultural South for reparation? Because it seems to be agriculture that's putting out the most. And more importantly, industrial emissions from fossil fuels do not affect the water holding capacity of the soil. Destruction of the soil structure destroys that capacity. So I've been following then for the last 4 or 5 years. If we go to the next one, Julian, and I saw this particular one. You're up on the verge of water catastrophe as the groundwater reserves dry up. And this is a very interesting one because an estimated 20 billion tons of water are discharged every year from Europe into the sea. And over 50 years, this equates to 1,000 billion tons. This is thought to account for 90% of sea level rise, and the water cycle is completely disrupted. Soil carbon is at its lowest level ever. But the lead scientists are still saying we must speed up reduction in fossil fuel emissions. Now, when you look at this, the temperatures are going up over Europe. This was part of what went into the film in that the rivers were drying up, soil carbon was the lowest ever, soil moisture was the lowest ever. And it suddenly dawned that for 50 years or more, we have been discharging all the water from the land into the sea. And the land was drying out. It was a sponge that was drying out. And then if you connect that to what does that do to the land, if the moisture is gone, you can begin to see a pattern that makes much more sense. And all I'm saying is we can argue about this. I'm quite happy, science is for discussion, that the climate change people are saying the heating effect is coming from the long-range radiation, which is reflecting back. What I'm saying is it's coming from the loss of water from the soil. Got the next one, Julian. The latest global report, just to try and drive home the importance of water, half the globe had dry river flow conditions. This, I think, came up about 2 weeks ago. There are critical changes in water availability. Stream flow levels the lowest in 33 years. Notable depletion of groundwater availability in North America and Europe, Chile and Jordan. Groundwater levels in long-term decline. The Amazon lakes, volume below normal, reduced water levels produce temperature rises to 34°C, algal blooms, death of the dolphin. Reduced water availability in North and South America, widespread dry conditions and elevated temperatures are producing extreme hydrological events. And there's a split now into prolonged droughts with significant floods elsewhere. Soil carbon continues to decrease. So they keep pushing the agenda that somehow it's the emissions from fossil fuels, but they don't seem to make the link that soil carbon, which is the biggest source of carbon on the planet, is decreasing as well. So I question, that is what I question. If we go to the next one, Julian. Thanks. This is one from Germany where it shows traditional agriculture abandoned and going over to full modern agriculture. And for years, we've been putting ammonia fertilizer on the soil with potassium and phosphorus, polluting the aquifers and so on. And this area was sprayed entirely with glyphosate, the whole area. Let's kill all the weeds. Unfortunately, they kill all the soil activity, the bacteria that fix carbon, fix nitrogen, legumes, and all the rest of it. And they turned the soil into a mush that could just wash away with the river. And I think over 100 people, 196 people died with this. And they're claiming that the emissions must go down. I would rather say that we have to reclaim the land. We have to regenerate so that it can hold water. So, next one. Now, in the late 40s and in the 50s, Dr. Penman, who worked at Soil Research in the UK, showed that the radiation coming down from the sun on a daily basis supplies, or can be split, if you like, as latent heat and sensible heat. The heat from the sun falling on a wet soil is taken away because the water absorbs the heat and evaporates. In a moist soil, it doesn't take as much because there's not enough water. And in sand, it takes hardly any of the latent heat. It switches to sensible heat, which is the heat that stays with the soil. So on the right-hand side, you can see that a wet soil, take the latent heat, will be minus on sensible. It's actually cooling the ground, but it starts to heat the ground on a moist soil and on the sand. Similarly, in urban heat islands, the city centres made of concrete, brick and tar macadam have no cooling mechanism. They simply heat up like night storage radiators. So in the city, in London, 32 degrees in the city centre, 28 on the urban, and on the farmland, 24. The difference being that the farmland has moisture. The moisture can evaporate, take the heat with it. And then this chap who was mentioned in the film, dry soil with no plant cover, he found that he was at 34 degrees C, the soil with plant cover that was absorbing part of the for photosynthesis, but also pumping water, 24. The River Nile, where you have these extreme temperatures on the border of the Nile, 38. And on Merowe, which is a ruined city out in the desert there, 55 degrees. So it starts to become quite clear that without water, the land heats up very, very seriously. Next one. Thanks. So I went back to the IPCC physics books, and the relative heating effect, the radiative heating, which is what they're talking about, caused by CO2, the greenhouse effect, there is an equation which I'll put in, their equations, which I'll put in a bit later. The radiative heating magnitude, the official figure, 4 to 5 watts per square meter. Your soil moisture loss, and these are figures that we've shown here and proved, 450 to 500 watts per square meter. So in other words, lost soil moisture is giving 100 times or more the heat effect to the soil. And the soil dries out and the water cycle is disrupted. Okay, Julian, thanks. Now, I went back and I looked again at some of the guys, and these guys at the bottom, I'll give them the reference, and I'm using their paper here, start to come out with some strange discussions in their papers, but what they show on one of them, the climate models used by the IPCC, when they've analysed them, show that soil moisture fluctuations have important impacts on surface latent heat flux, which is what we've just been talking about. And thus they regulate the surface temperature variations of the soil and the planet. And consistently, we find that fluctuations in soil moisture amplify the temperature variation in dry regions, so the land gets hotter and hotter, whereas in wet regions, the temperature variability is muted by plentiful surface soil moisture. So these official IPCC guys are starting to hint that maybe it's not what we've been thinking. Maybe the surface and its moisture content is what is actually producing these problems in unstable weather. Julian, thanks. Yeah. And I've just put this equation, I've got this from the Physics of Climate Change, which is one of the leading guys, the IPCC. And what it says is that CO2 of 600 now, relative to 278 in 1750, using that equation, which is fairly straightforward, gives you 3.6 to 4.5 watts. And I don't disagree with that. It's fine, no problem, except it's 100 times less than the value of heating we're getting from destroying soil. Next one, thanks. So this is actually what you've got. On the left-hand side, you've got the net radiation from the sun is split into the latent heat and the sensible heat. Latent heat being that which lifts water out of the soil. Sensible heat stays with the soil and heats the soil. When you have low soil moisture, your surface temperature of the soil 55. This is what we're finding down just away from the Nile. And the air temperature 40. With an air temperature of 32 above your surface temperature of 35 is because your heat is going into water, which is evaporating and taking the heat with it. So I just put that into a little schematic. And you've got the soil on one side drying out, the surface staying perfectly green on the other. Because it has soil carbon, it hasn't turned to sand like the Sahara Desert. Next one. Thanks. So my view is quite simple. The policy of net zero is based upon the abolition of fossil fuel use and decarbonisation as a means of cutting carbon dioxide, allegedly the cause of global warming. If that's so, it is a small component of the total CO2 emissions, as we've shown, from the whole of our ecosystem. Now, supplies of oil and gas, which between them are plentiful in the UK, are obtained from overseas at huge cost to the people, and with the added deficit that the jobs that go with these extractive and supply industries being transferred abroad. There is no improvement in emissions. Vast amounts of subsidy are imposed on the UK population, and once again, they are used to benefit employment and economies elsewhere, Denmark, Germany, and China. The resulting turbines and solar panels are noted, however, for their lack of output in the autumn and winter months when energy is needed. The policy, as far as I'm concerned, has no rational basis, since it's dependent on external sources and thus not sustainable. The designated renewables fail to meet any criteria for energy output continuity or economic efficiency. And now we have the imposition of legal requirements and unremitting media focus are actually being used to divert attention away from the true nature of the problem. Each new crisis is presented as a single issue, emissions problem, instead of a multivariate social equation, manifesting essentially in the disruption of the water cycle. Thanks. Next one, Julian. I thought I'd just put this in because I worked in nuclear. I did nuclear physics as well as chemical physics. And I worked in coal and natural gas. And so I thought I'd do a little comparison. This actually is from chemical engineering, Journal of Green Energy. And it's used to calculate the relative strength, if you like, or power from the different sources of fuel. Solar is quite weak when you take, the whole of it's coming from the sun. It's a very long distance. It hits on small panels, and yes, you do get some. Wind, 10 miles per hour, 7 joules per cubic meter. And they do that by creating a theoretical model of a tube of wind coming past the rotors as they're turning. So they relate it back to the swept volume and the amount of volume of sun that falls on the panel. Tidal waters. Now you look at coal or oil, 45 billion, petrol, 10 billion, natural gas, 40 million, nuclear, 2 million times fossil fuel. You have not a hope in hell of replacing your oil, coal, petrol, natural gas, or solar with wind or solar. Wind and solar are both what they call high entropy systems. That means they are irregular, they are not dependable. At night, the solar goes out, and if we get high pressure, the wind disappears. And I've left the reference to the journal there, so you can see how that's used to calculate the effectiveness of using different forms of energy. So, next one, Julian, thanks. That is for the first part of the talk, because what I'm going to move on to, I'll just finish off with two things now. One is the latest report, which I saw today, from the UN saying that the world is on track for a catastrophic rise in temperature. It's going to be 3.1 degrees, runaway global warming, higher than pre-industrial levels, and there is no safe amount of climate change. The previous goal to limit warming was 1.5. We've gone past that, and now we're into hyper global warming. Now, it actually showed a picture of Asia, where the people were wading through a meter deep of water. I didn't have time to put it on, I just literally ran it off. But that region, because I worked there, and I was saying to Ian earlier, in 1947, after independence of that area, 33% of the area was forested. Now it's only 5%. The population has gone up from roughly 34 million to 225 million. And you take out all the trees, damage the soil, you've got a very good case for flooding. But they don't mention that, it's just put down as a disaster. I also had a colleague send me recently another report, which is the Norwegian government, which said, is global warming a man-made or natural phenomenon? And Statistics Norway, which is the recent government report, says, the government Statistics Norway recently released a report that concludes the effect of man-made CO2 emissions does not appear to be sufficiently strong to cause systematic changes in the pattern of the temperature fluctuations. Our analysis indicates that with the current level of knowledge, it seems impossible to determine how much of the temperature increase is due to emissions of CO2. Similarly, on the timescale of recent millennia, current temperatures are nothing unusual. Now, this one then says the current decadal mean temperature, and they've gone back 400,000 years, in Greenland has not exceeded the envelope of natural variability of the past 4,000 years. So, according to the Norwegian government, the sideline is that the defection is important for the Norwegian government because climate alarmism can survive only if it is deemed an official consensus, so that people who point out inconsistent facts can be censored. Once the purported consensus is punctured, it rapidly becomes clear that the climate emperor is unclothed. I didn't have time to put that in, so So from my point of view, I think it stacks up more in favour of loss of soil moisture than it does in CO2. But science is never closed, so I'm quite happy for it to be debated on. What I'd like to do now is just talk about something else that happened 50 years ago, which had a similar pattern to the climate change scenario. So we're going to go on catchment modelling, and what you're seeing now is on the right-hand side, ICI at Billingham, which was one of the biggest chemical facilities in the world. It also has a small-scale petrol station, and it has contaminated land, and it has sewage at the bottom. Moving across left, you've got massive sewage discharge through storm, you've got flooding of a built-up area, and you've got flooding of a country area. Now, flooding not with just water, but with water and sewage. And the question that was put is, can we replace all the things on the right-hand side with all the things on the left-hand side? The effluent treatment, which is not effective at ICI, was going into the T's, the petrol leaking from the petrol stations, and the pesticides leaking from this there at the bottom, which was a pesticide factory that burned down. So that's what we're going to look at. If you're the next one, Julian, please. Oh, where's that gone?
Yeah.
Press it again and see what happens. Now. So in 1997 in New Delhi, I was giving the lecture for the 50th anniversary of Indian independence. And I'd been in and out of that area as a government scientist advising the Indian and other Asian governments for about 7, 8, 9 years. And what I'd seen was getting rid of the forests, the instability that was creating, seeing the soil damage, and then seeing the water shortages. And so what I said was, I've got the information together, 17 countries in the Middle East, including Syria, Jordan, and Egypt, as well as South Africa, Pakistan, southern India, northern China, will face absolute water scarcity by 2025. Now, I put this together in 1997, so it wasn't too bad a forecast. And my intention was to try and sort of frighten them a little bit. Next one, please. In countries 24 in sub-Saharan Africa, severe economic water scarcity by 2025. Finally, down at the bottom there. This was one of the killers. Globally, 70% of water taken from rivers or aquifers is used for irrigation and food. 60 to 85% of this is wasted and discharged into the sea. That was the start of the big pattern where all the water that's on the land is being thrown into the sea without even thinking about it. The aquifers are going down, the soil is drying out because you can't irrigate, and the temperatures are going up. And that was 1997. It's carried on since then, and is now we're seeing one of the end games of it. So next one, thanks. So I'm looking at water and saying, do we have a problem? Well, water and sewage companies keep asking for more money from the public. Despite these ever-increasing demands, the function of our sewage systems continue to deteriorate. The problems are highly visible. Untreated sewage discharged into rivers, storm overflow producing floodwater contaminated with sewage, ammonia and phosphorus polluting rivers and lakes, rivers now classed as biohazard do not swim, and the government cannot fund a renationalisation and has little room for manoeuvre. That's where we are. Next one, please. We have 347,000 kilometres of sewers. They carry 11 billion litres of sewage per day. But the UK gained 1 million people in the last 2 years with no additional sewer capacity. Areas of the country have seen an additional 10 to 25% of rainfall because of the climate instability, and this adds to the sewage volume. Dilute sewage is more difficult to treat and more expensive. And vast areas of the UK are now regularly being flooded with dilute sewage, which is a biohazard. Sewage is responsible for using 2 to 3% of our grid energy, and last year totaled 16.5 million kilowatt hours. We have an association of problems. We have not only sewage that is not being treated, but we have sewage which is still taking 16.5 million kilowatts to treat, vast amount of energy with all the emissions, if you want to look at the emissions. The dilute sewage is more difficult to treat. And we have a huge biohazard going out into the hills and valleys when the rivers overflowed and the sewage spills out. Next one, Julian. So it's all interlinked. We have high construction costs, high operating costs, and ineffective treatment leading to poor quality of discharge, ineffective against ammonia, phosphorus, and many recalcitrant chemicals, ineffective against viral and bacteriological contamination, and a funding model that's allowed profits to be taken out and leaving behind a huge unfunded debt burden. Sewage is one of the largest emissions on the planet, and it is mainly carbon. If we could alter our thinking about people and ecosystems, perhaps mankind would benefit. So let's look at the pioneering of soil plant ecosystems. Thanks. Next. Just have a look at this. I waxed a bit poetic here. As the age of Aquarius dawns, I can't see it here, but I think what it says is the age of Aquarius dawning. A number of scientists in Germany and the UK, Reinhold, my colleague over in Germany, and myself here, began experimenting with soil plant systems. I was doing it to clean up contamination from the old coal gas industry. I'd been asked by the government to look at ways of dealing with that contamination. So I was looking at microbiology, soil and plants. Reinhold was in Germany looking at sewage treatment with plants. It took many years to fathom the complexity and staggering capability of our natural environment and to understand that nature could carry out transformations that our best engineers could only regard in awe and yet could not reproduce by classical engineering methods. The use of plants and soil with its accompanying bacteria to degrade sewage was a milestone in natural systems engineering. A system that was built in a small area in Germany was used for a period of 16 years to treat sewage from communities in Germany. The water coming out, the results, were always above expectation and superior to conventional works. The exact knowledge of how these systems achieve this is still under investigation even now, but it is clear that nature is a powerful ally to man if man will use it and not abuse it. Unfortunately, the nature of man intervened. Next one, please. Here's a picture of the small system that was built and the tree line beyond, behind those chaps, and the trees just in the middle of the picture there were the limit of the system. The sewage in the local area was split. Half of it went to a conventional works and half of it came to this pilot works. It came through, it was macerated, came through, overfed from the inlet trams down into the soil, through the soil plant's bacteria, and then went off down the channel in the middle of the picture to keep the rest of that nature reserve wet with water. It had been going for 16 years at that point, and it was sequestering carbon and phosphorus, and nitrogen was being removed. So what happened, next one please, how does it work? On the right hand side in the top is a picture of the root structure. In this case, the root structure of a wetland species called Phragmites. And you can see a very powerful rhizome with a secondary and a tertiary structure. And what's happening from the sky above, you get oxygen running down that thick primary into the secondaries and diffusing out into the soil, just the same way that we breathe. So oxygen carried into the soil. The reed bed, the reeds in there kept it permeable, so the sewage could flow through, and the bacteria there were tackling the sewage. And around the reeds, it was aerobic. Away from the reeds, anaerobic. Man has never been able to copy that and put an anaerobic and an aerobic structure in the same place. But that is what nature does here. And it destroys and humidifies all of the carbon, sequesters the phosphorus for later use, because it's getting short, and it gets rid of ammonia. Next one, Julian. So it adds structure to the soil and enables the soil bacteria respiration. Oxygen being pumped in, CO2, nitrogen, water, ammonia, all being trapped and destroyed there. So the water that came out was biologically pure. And that means that all of the virals, the bacteria were totally destroyed and it was clean. At the same time, any chemicals that had gone in from a local factory were destroyed as well. So next one. This hopefully will become interesting. Now, the energy and emissions, on the left, you have the reed bed system. For 16 years, it was monitored. On the left-hand side, all it needed was a pump, and it used 35,000 kilowatt hours to take the sewage to that system. After that, the system used nothing. It was solar powered, and it was down through a gradient, hydraulic gradient. So the electric consumption, 35,000 kilowatt hours, used 17,000 kilograms of coal. The activated sludge system on the other side of the road used 40 million kilowatt hours, 20 million kilograms of coal. The emissions, therefore, at the bottom, 47,000 kilograms of CO2 from that pumping system, 53 million kilograms from the activated sludge. And you've got NOx and SOx going out as well. Approximately 5,500 tons of CO2 equivalent were sequestered as humic carbon in the soil. Now, they're talking today about handing out millions in grants for carbon sequestration into, I don't know, probably solid calcium carbonate and shoving it down a coal mine. Totally useless, another waste of money. This reed bed did 5,500 tons because essentially sewage is carbon. Put it into the soil, transform it, and you're growing biomass. Next one, please. So, what we did with a small group of us, I didn't particularly want to go to the Water Research Centre. In industry, I'd worked with them in the UK. They were the control section, research section of the water industries, and I didn't trust them one bit. But I organised a visit by all the UK water authorities and the Water Research Centre to go and visit the sewage works and some of the chemical operations that I was doing, cleaning up pollution from gas works. Every single water authority went and they collectively wrote a report. It was unanimously in favour of the system and stated that all the authorities should come up with a construction of this much cheaper, energy efficient and low emission soil-based reed beds. The WRC told us that they needed 30,000 systems in the UK. And Oceans, which is what it was then before I retired, was paid a few £1,000s for the initial consultancy on the technology. But then the privatisation of the water industry was announced. Strangely, clients that we had, various jobs, began to cancel their projects. And a colleague there says that what was happening, the water authorities, the WRC, were going around and buying out the contracts. So at Osraisen, the local civil engineering contractors were allowed to damage the system by bulldozing the inlets. We were out of business within 6 months. The WRC then decided that soil systems did not work, and only gravel, which is biologically inert, should be used. And the age of wetland technology had arrived. Next one, please. The WRC applied and received for 30 million from the European Union to establish an expert group on wetlands and natural systems. Initially Europe, then the Americas, together with Asia and Australia, were brought in and coordinated by WRC. Academics and university groups were organised and national and international conferences have been held ever since. Universities, academics were given money to study the gravel-based wetland systems. All publications in eminent journals were only allowed from recognised sources. All relevant government departments were staffed by wetland experts. And the media blocked efforts to discuss the genuine science of reed beds, instead promoting the fake science of wetlands. As a result, there are thousands of sewage works where gravel beds with reeds in them were tagged onto the outlets, greenwash. These are now blocked and useless and will require twice as much to replace as they did to build, but they seldom contributed to the treatment. And what you can see there is how big business working with government has all the academics on the payroll through the grants, but they can only research what they're told. All government departments have wetland experts and will point everybody towards the preferred technology. And the media, similarly, are all brought online. It's an exact parallel with what's happening with climate. Next one, please. Now, in the mid-80s, the author, that's me, I was giving lectures at Durham University on the breakdown of phenols and cyanide using chemical and biological means as part of my reclamation of the old gas works. The phenol division of ICI were regular attenders, and they spoke to their problems with their effluent going to the Tees estuary. And despite great efforts, they could not meet the ever stricter standards that were in the offing. Could reed beds help? It was explained that prior to the unwelcome attention of the water industry, the destruction of phenols had been studied in my small laboratory. And yes, there were reasons for cautious optimism. Much to the chagrin of the wetlanders, a series of small beds were constructed at ICI Billingham, and the 2-year research programme produced not only a solution for phenol, but of all of the other agents in the 200 species chemical effluent. ICI at that time was the biggest chemical manufacturer in Europe, over 250 batch production chemicals, and it was a real hodgepodge of materials, pesticide, you name it, everything. After a further 4 years, a full-scale system was constructed, and it was shown and served to treat all effluent of every ICI unit for 30 years until the closure of ICI. Next one, Julian. Thanks. So in the background, you can see ICI on a typical summer day up at Billingham. And the input to that was 3,000 tonnes a day of very high strength, what we call COD, phenols, amines, detergents, everything in there, no pre-treatment, pumped across the system. Over 30 years of operation. Sorry, 17,000 tonnes of carbon were sequestered, and it never in 30 years failed to meet the standards. Indeed, the water was so clean, it could go back to ICI for processed water. Those gentlemen were from Indian Oil and Sudan Oil, and later we had China National, because they had big problems in the oil industry. They had come to see it because they had been told about it and wanted to see what was happening. Next one, Julian, if you're still there, thanks. At the same time, I was working for Sainsbury's, and I was a contaminated land expert. This was a pesticide factory that caught fire, burnt down, the reactors spilt onto the soil, and a heavy wad of pesticide contamination went into the ground on top of the aquifer. It was a major emergency. Accidentally, Sainsbury's had bought it. They didn't realise what they were buying. And they had to have a major clean-up because of the pesticides. So we worked on this. We hardened up the microbiology and the plants. You can see just at the end of the digger there, the water table was there. And we constructed a system. Next one, Julian, thanks. Now, the reed bed performance here, you can see ammonia, anionic detergents, COD. The key thing is you've got cypermethrin, diazinon, dichlorofenson, dealdrin, endrin, lindane, mothwood, DDT. All of those have gone into the aquifer. And the water authorities were in an absolute panic. We did an X-ray of the ground and we could see the pathways through the chalk where the water was pulling these out of the chalk into what was a drinking water supply. So we drilled in and we put high and low level boreholes and we pumped the water back up and we passed it through a reed bed system that we built on the ground. Show the next one, Julian. Thanks. So the water came up from the aquifer, went through a soil-based bioremediation system, below ground, no free water on the top, and then was re-injected further back up the aquifer so that we had a cyclical system that cleaned the aquifer up and protected the drinking water. And that went on for many, many years. So next one, Julian, thanks. So we had ICI, soil-based, treating every chemical that they were making. And we had the dangerous ones, like the pesticides and herbicides. And we knew from elsewhere that we could treat the viral loads. So one of the greatest losses of the suppression of this technology, because it was not rolled out in the industry, was the impact on the public health. The discharge of storm-conditioned sewage is creating flood havoc in many communities. In studying sewage and reed beds, it was noted that the bacteria and viruses and other diseases were completely eliminated from the sewage water as it emerged clean from the system. And it was clear that in addition to toxic chemicals, the reed beds were destroying the pathogens harmful to man. I did some plating out, which you could do in those days in a small laboratory. As it liquid, it went through a system, and it became clear that antibiotic rings were present and that the system was manufacturing antibiotics to kill the pathogens. It was also clear that the system was responsive to changes in the nature of the pathogen input. Thus, if modified E. coli, which was a particular threat at the time, was within input, it did not go through the system. The activity was also present with respect to viral contamination. Next one, please. This, rather than building in the UK, colleagues over in Canada built this one for a small town in Newfoundland. And what you can see here, on the left, the sludge settling chambers, the sewage came in, pumped from the local community as it had been at Egley, and there was a stormwater bed, and you can see that its bund area is higher than the others. That means that it could trap any storm conditions. You could then go to a vertical bed down through, and you could go to horizontal beds. This configuration allowed sewage to come concentrated or dilute with stormwater, and yet it was all treated to well within all the consents required by the Canadian government. Next one, please. So the population was 1,500 approximately. The population equivalent, because of cafes and things like that, was 1,800. Average design flow, 3,000 metre cube a day. Peak flow, 4.5. Extreme peak flow, the stormwater, 12,000 metre cube per day, which is roughly what happens to the UK works, except here, sewage goes straight through the works because it cannot handle storms. It's a design problem which has been well overcome by these. If we go to the next one, Julia, you can see that we have no loss. The red figures are the percent reduction in sewage BOD, suspended solids, nitrogen, phosphorus, coliforms, fecal, and so on. They are all well within standards, and you can in fact build a system that will give you 0 total coliforms and fecal coliforms. So very clean. On the right-hand side, 5,000 total coliforms is the allowed standard, 770 is what's achieved. So they perform really well. Once you've got the liquid to them, you don't need energy, they're solar powered, and they work just by flowing down the hydraulic gradient in the soil. Next one, Julian, thanks. Those gentlemen that came to ICI were actually operating in Sudan. The Chinese had moved in, so the Chinese, the Malaysians, the Indians were working on the Sudan oil fields, which were growing. Their problem was, as you can see in that line of ponds there, they were, when oil comes up from the ground and goes through the separators, you do get oil, but you get very oily water. And they were not allowed to re-inject it because it would pollute the high-level aquifer. So I was called in, and we built these systems, the nice green bits on the left-hand side, and then stored the water, and then we passed it through those systems, and it came out absolutely clean by World Health Authority standards. All international standards were met. And so what we did, you have a wet season for 3 months of the year, because the oil industry asked, what happens when we finish with the oil industry and we stop produced water, as it was called? What happens if you do anything for the community? So what we did, we tapped into all of the catchments, and all of the rainfall, which was 7,000 meters cubed per hectare per annum, was funneled into the large dam, a 2 million storage catchment system. So the water is going through. On the left-hand side, what you can't see is a vast lake full of fish. And then from the lake, it carries on going downstream. And we put 10,000 hectares to start with of hardwoods, so that the local community had timber to work with. In the foreground, the brown area is the agricultural area that we put for food crops, cereal crops, and biofuel crops, so that we could, when the oil had gone, 700 kilometers from Khartoum here, there's not a lot of infrastructure, so your biodiesel can supply local communities with power. These were the largest engineered soil bed systems in the world. And for the whole of the Sudan industry, we built facilities able to clean 500,000 tons per day of produced water up to clean water potable standards. And all of that could be put into biofuels, agriculture, local industry. It would have been if they didn't start fighting and driving tanks and all the rest of it. However, my daughter works there now and is repairing a lot of the systems and bringing them back online. So we'll get there in the end. Next one, please, Julian. It's almost 50 years since this knowledge of this technology was introduced to the water companies. From a scale of 10 meter cubed to 500,000 tons a day, the system has been adopted in many parts of the world, treating all types of effluent, including sewage. In the UK, the water authorities, the universities, the governments, the media, all blocked knowledge of this technology, despite being told that wetlands were a fake copy that would not perform adequately. Many thousands were built and stand abandoned, completely blocked and useless. That is exactly the same scenario that's happening with net zero. Another fake project that is swallowing vast amounts of public money, destroying industries and leading to blackouts in the coming months and years as the wind drops and the sun stops shining. Thank you very much. I hope that we all understand. So, hello, I've lost everyone.
Thank you, Lucian, very much indeed for that fantastic.
Is anybody still awake? My apologies.
Right. So yeah, that quite an amazing journey and a great exposition of some huge concepts to deal with here. I will open up to discussion if that's okay. If you'd like to raise your hand, then that would be the best way to control that, if that's okay. So has anybody got any immediate question for Lucian there? Craig.
Yes, thank you. Excellent presentation.
Thank you.
I learned a lot about soil from your presentation. What I wanted to offer, though, also is research that was done by a man, C.M. Countryman, in Northern California in the 60s.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with him?
No, I'm not. Sorry, no.
He did a study where he measured the temperature in a forest, on the forest floor and in the canopy, and then out in a clear cut. And at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the forest canopy and floor were 87 degrees. Out in the clear cut, it was 153 degrees.
Yes. Yeah.
The dramatic impacts of forests being removed and converted is far more. It has a much shorter time frame, and is far greater in the impacts. And the climate change people oftentimes are using climate change myopically, rather than understanding the dynamics that even a plantation is going to be far hotter than a multi-age story species forest. So have you looked at that dynamic? Because I think that certainly you make a very strong case for soil, but I think that deforestation is huge worldwide.
Yeah.
And that dramatic difference is also really pushing us over the edge.
Absolutely. I mean, I essentially call the trees the spark plug of the system, because it's the trees that really drive what's going on. I was relating it to UK because we're seeing Europe, it's soil that is being destroyed very badly. But yeah, I worked in Indonesia, Malaya, and so on. And with the monsoons, the forests are vital. And I think we are, I'm not denying, I think we have severe climate instability. I do not think that it's part of the long-range infrared thing that they talk about. It is part of getting rid of the trees and damaging the soil. And I think we're moving into a very dangerous endgame now. In Sudan at this moment, we're probably 11th parallel. You have got vast areas of flood, and you've got an equal area of drought, because the whole of the weather system has moved, if you like, from left to right, across towards the mountains, because you're deforesting, and your stability has gone, and your climate is just going haywire. So no, I agree entirely. It is a major problem. Look, I mean, to me, the picture they're showing in the latest UN panic report says it all. In that part of Asia, there are floods. We've got to cut emissions. No, in that part of Asia, you chop down all of the trees. So, so I agree. Yeah, no, I agree entirely.
Yeah. Right. Alice, have you got a question there? Yeah.
Well, yes, sorry, I couldn't find the hands. I had to put my finger up.
That's okay. That'll do.
It won't like Halloween at the moment, do you?
Well, there's lots of things I want to ask you, but I think I'll hone in on you talk about glyphosates damaging the soil, but from my experience, the fungicides are as bad for
Do what, sorry?
Fungicidal use. So we coat our anything. So I mean, it's very easy to think it's the glyphosates are the bad thing. My understanding, and do correct me if I'm wrong, is if you've got a really healthy, vibrant, sort of healthy biome within your soil, it can manage and uncontaminate itself, having had the effect of the sort of the use of the glyphosate, as long as you don't do it too often. So that if we were to ban glyphosates completely, we lose a tool in our land management box, which means we then have to start battering the soil with mechanical implements, which is as destructive for the fungicidal, the mycorrhizal stuff, which actually binds the soil and forms the aggregates, which lets the water percolate. So that it's not. So it was really like, what's your feeling about that? How careful can we be careful enough with the use of glyphosates if we are observant and aware enough of the impact of all the chemicals that we put on our soil, and allowing the soil to actually restructure itself, give it time to deal with what we're doing to it? Or should we just leave it alone completely?
To be honest, I would leave it alone completely. If you have, let's say, a healthy soil, if you can find one these days, the soil has a complete balance. It has its assassins. If things are coming into the soil that would be bad, then they'll become rid of. It has its glue manufacturing system. It actually will soil the top soil, into aggregates to protect it against the rain. Oh, is this my internet that's unstable? So, yeah. But glyphosate, I think, has such a broad spectrum kill that it's doing more damage than good, particularly if it kills off the ones that are giving out the glue. So I would do away with it altogether. Now that gives, I admit, some very difficult things, because Whereas, say, in the late 40s, if you went to Rockhampstead or any of our agricultural universities, they would not even like NPK fertilizers.
Yeah.
Because they knew the damage that could happen. You were looking at bone meal, and all the stuff you can buy from the garden shop, all natural. And I'm sure, in fact, there is a film that talks about we must not move on to chemicals because so I'm in favour of organic carbon, good soil completely, and not fertilizers or pesticides or fungicides or ivermectins coming from the cows.
May I respond?
Yeah, please do. Yeah, it's a discussion, not a.
Well, only that my experience is that if we want to grow food sustainably, then we have. I don't like nitrates and phosphates. I think if we manage our soil and it's a healthy soil, it will make what nutrients the plant needs available to it. So as a livestock farmer, we talk about digestible protein and non-digestible protein, and I think that from a plant's point of view, there's digestible elements and non-digestible elements within the soil, and if we understand that the way that the plant manages that stomach is it has the soil as its stomach, the fungicide and the bacteria within it digest the food for it, then we start to begin to realize that if we pick the soil up and put it through a sieve and stamp all over it, we're damaging it. So it's really important not to disturb it and give the opportunity for humates to oxidize by power harrowing it. It's actually, if we're going to try and be sustainable, but we've got to grow food, then better to not to till it and to grow our soil so that it actually increases in volume, not just because it gets more spongy, but actually we are creating a soil by capturing carbon into it. Then the way that we manage the sort of the weeds, which make it it doesn't tick the box from a consumer's point of view. We don't want to have too much black grass in our wheat. We don't want to do other things to it. Then occasionally we might have to use a chemical, but as your experience with ICI showed, the soil, given time, given space, is capable of managing that, but we've got to give it the time to respond.
Yes. What I call the pilot system, small scale systems, 10 meter cube, 10 meter square, sorry, which we built within ICI, was really a biological experiment because the effluents had literally, you imagine, they manufactured all the country's fairy liquid, they manufactured all of the amines, the 250 chemicals. It was all about allowing the soil to adapt. The soil bacteria, yeah. But bear in mind, the soil was structured by a very powerful root system, which was done by wetland species because they transport their own oxygen into the soil, whereas the terrestrials don't. So you can use a wetland and you can flood it, you can saturate the soil with chemicals, and around the reeds you've got anaerobic and aerobic bacteria together. They can tackle whatever you're throwing at them if you give them a chance. 10, 20 days, or depending on what it is. But I would actually say that there's virtually nothing that the soil given time could not degrade. But I'm talking about it being structured by a wetland plant, which essentially is a living system. So, but I still think glyphosate on a terrestrial soil would cause big problems. So, well, that's an opinion. I mean, it's something that could be tried.
Yeah.
Thank you there. It's an ongoing debate, I think, for quite a while. Craig, came in first there.
Yeah, thank you. I wanted to offer a couple different thoughts on climate change with the backdrop of the Einstein quote, "You can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created it." And that a major problem with trying to address climate change is that when we define success in terms of opulence and conspicuous consumption, we can't get there from here.
Mm.
But also, I think there's another major caveat that needs to be addressed, and that is, who is the master? Is nature the master, or is our illusions of domination and control the master? And I think that fundamental question is key in understanding which path truly might be sustainable. Your comments?
Yes. I went through a difficult problem, but I was classically educated, so I did chemical engineering to start with the gas board, and then I did honours in physics and chemistry, and so I was then applying myself to the problem of looking at the contamination from the old gasworks. North Sea gas came in, the gasworks were closed down, and in the meantime, I'd also done a PhD in dynamics. So I was very much standard scientist. But I began to see, as I studied the plants and bacteria and bioremediation, that something was going on which was not in the textbooks. And the more you did, the more you realized that the more nature could do if you give it a chance. But when I went to ICI had a big problem. They had 25 of their chemists, or of their engineers, chemists, everybody was there. Are you really serious that we're going to treat this stuff with daffodils? It was that sort of conversations we had. So I had, in the 80s, any number of years. Fortunately, some of the people, and the same happened at British Steel down in Clanwilliam in South Wales, there were one or two people who turned up who said, no, we've got to give it a go, and we'll give it a go because we don't have another answer. And we're going to be prosecuted if this stuff goes in the river. I think they wanted to give it a go because they had a slightly different mindset, not because they were going to be prosecuted. But I can understand how difficult it is to try and change your mind to a new way of thinking. And I still remember the guy, the head of the gas industry, who came to see us and genuinely told us that the gas that came ashore was the people's gas and we'd only be paying a penny a therm, and he believed it. Mm. He was totally unaware of what the bankers were thinking. But it showed that behind the scenes there are some difficult people to deal with.
Yeah.
Who they take things different way to us. Oh, I've lost it.
Thank you. Thank you, Lucian. I think your internet is a little bit dodgy. Perhaps, Julian, you could...
Thank you, Ian. It does look like we've lost Lucian. You can hear us. Thank you for the presentation, Lucian.
Oh, back again, I think.
I'm just going to pick up on Craig's point regarding sustainability.
On me.
Can you hear? We can see you, but we as a still image, but we can only hear you. Are you there? I'll press on in the hope that Lucian can join in.
Hey.
Are you back, Lucian? No. Okay. Oh, he's back. He's back. Lucian.
I'm back. Yeah. Hi.
I was just going to pick up on well, first of all, thank you for the presentation. We're long-term colleagues, so I'm very familiar with your extraordinary work.
Well, you were down to do it if I...
Yeah, well, I can tell you, after I very embarrassingly did a primetime TV show with a gravel reed bed in the early 90s,
Oh gosh.
which reinforced the madness that WRC were promoting. And then a very good friend of mine said, I think you should go and look at ICI Billingham. I suspect they really know what they're doing. And indeed, that was the case. That was how I met Lucian over 30 years ago now. But no, I just wanted to link the point that Craig made in terms of sustainability and Alice's point about glyphosate, whether it has a future role. Incredible technology. I mean, to be able to desiccate a crop and save on all those grain drying costs potentially, to blitz black grass. Yeah, extraordinary. The problem is, well, there's huge problems. Farmers are paying a fortune for this technology. It's a major expense that farmers have to meet. Of course, in terms of the farmer's perspective, it enables a level of productivity that enables their business to continue. But there's huge problems here. The externalized costs, the unaccounted externalized costs, the flood runoff. I mean, I play a little game. I occasionally use the railways. And every time there's a rail cancellation because of flooding, I check out where it is. And the majority of times it's in an area of heavily glyphosate-treated arable land. Now, what is the cost of that? Well, it turns out something that I actually had an involvement with. There is a process and a great book, True Cost Accounting. It turns out that for all the incredible technology and productivity of modern chemical farming, and we can't deny the increase in yields and all the rest of it has been incredible, it doesn't actually cover its costs. It operates at a colossal loss because the externalized costs, of which flood and drought are just several. Let's not even go into public health. Check out the Monsanto papers. They haven't even done the public health studies. And so in the words of people in the US looking at this, Monsanto have completely poisoned the academic well. This is what Lucian is talking about in terms of his work. So we can feed the world through other means. I mentioned in the preamble, I'm an irrigation man. Just for God's sake, store stormwater and enable farmers to irrigate with it. Encourage smaller farms, because the smaller the farm, there's a logarithmic scale down to an allotment level where you'll get a tenfold increase in productivity at an allotment level over broadacre farming. So, like so much in our society, agriculture, and I don't want to do down people who use chemicals as farmers. Farming is bloody hard work, whichever way you do it. But like so much in our society, huge change is coming in agriculture. It has to, because we can't afford it anymore.
Yeah, one of the points that, I'm probably getting a bit too long in the tooth now, but when I was looking at the antibiotics, I was astounded because I looked at it, I thought, well, you could take the antibiotic range. I mapped out how you could get the structure of the antibiotic. And basically, you had a reactive system that would continuously give you new antibiotics as your MRSAs and all these things started going. But equally, the plants at some point were giving off polymers in their roots, and they were lining up things, enzymes in the polymers. And what I realized was that there is such a wealth of new things in the soil and plant systems that if we studied that, we've got new products that will go on sort of forever, that can do things that we can't even imagine. Now, that's just a side, but we just don't study it often enough. It's not taught. So, well, yes, no, you're right. You are right. What happened then?
Alice, would you like to respond?
Yes, please.
Halloween again.
Yeah, yes. Well, in terms of the antibiotics in the soil, you may or may not be aware there's a product used in agriculture for cleaning dairies, for treating digital dermatitis, mastitis, And it's called Pruex, and it was designed by a Nuffield farming scholar a few years back. And he went to Canada and looked at the way that they managed infection rates in their operating theatres in hospitals. I don't know if you remember this. Anyway, he's brought it back and developed a product for agriculture. It's called Pruex. And it's based on bacteria in soil. And what you do is you basically use the soil bacteria to sort of wash and populate the area so that it doesn't make a space for the unwanted bacteria to grow. And I think it must also be a little bit like that. East Germany didn't have antibiotics, so they produced bacteria libraries to sort of combat disease. But what I think is fascinating is one of the side effects they're now seeing is that herds of cattle who are treated with Pruex for dermatitis and mastitis are obviously ingesting it somewhat because they're also having less issues with their gut. So they're having acidosis, they're having less
absorption.
And it's also they're finding that where the cattle are going through these foot dips with the Pruex and then out onto pastures, that not only they're not getting so lame, but the pastures are getting reinvigorated. So it's actually reseeding the soil with good bacteria, which are managing to sort of not completely cure the after effects of nitrate application. I say application rather than contamination. I'm really not keen on that, on nitrates being added. So it's fascinating that all these little things, all these little signposts, but we are so to accept them. And I think that's with my coaching hat on, psychology hat on. We are, as a species, resistant to change to our detriment. And I think that for phrasing the argument, I mean, you talked about the droughts in Mexico. I was at a Congress September before last for European economic rights, where a bunch of lawyers got together and said, look, what are we going to do? How are we going to manage the law around water catchment and water and aquifers and how we all interact with each other, because it's becoming a real problem. And we can see countries fighting in Europe, from France, Germany, Spain, Italy, Morocco, we can see European countries having real problems if we don't get the law sorted out. And even if we do have the law, they're still going to probably go to start fighting over this. And this is Europe, this is us. It's not far away in another country. This is right here on our doorstep.
Well, that is it's quite a depressing thought.
We don't even treat the I bet I mean, I live in a sort of small area housing estate, but all of the water that comes down is very carefully captured and sent into the drains. And every housing development and every road and what is built to capture rainwater and everything and send it off down the rivers and the sea. If we actually brought it back and used it, then it would be a lot. I mean, we're on the edge of the Atlantic, so we're going to get wetter and wetter and wetter now as we pick up the sea temperature. But we need to change even our cities, how they're planned, everything. So I'll shut up now. Your turn again. Sorry.
Over to Julian.
Just a quickie, because I've taken too much time already, but absolutely, and Alice, big fan of probiotics. I did a little bit of work on probiotic treatment of antibiotic-resistant mastitis. If my memory serves me right, it's an issue that costs us several $100 million a year. Am I right with that? Is that recollection correct? It's a huge cost, and I don't know about the Pruex, I think you said, but I was trying another multi-species probiotic, and we saved 2 cattle from the knacker's yard, but we couldn't do anything with it because it would have cost £10 million to have had this product safety checked to fill it for that, and it was a generic product that no one was going to invest that money in because you couldn't protect it. But I just want to reiterate, because I think this is a really key point. I mean, we've come close to water wars, as you're hinting, Alice, here in the Cotswolds. I assure you, when my 3 miles of some of the best trout fishing was pumped dry by Thames Water in the late 80s to open the way to privatization, water theft. And let's not go too much into the water industry, but it was our water that was basically stolen by the privatization. And the tragedy is we don't need this shocking threat of water wars or critical flood risks, the solutions are all there, whether it's antibiotic-resistant mastitis in cattle, or all the rest of our social problems. As someone who's worked in the community interest, and I know most of us here do this, but I've been at it for a long time. All the answers are there, but corrupt academia, corrupt corporations, and PR are stopping these solutions being seeing the light of day. Anyway, I said too much.
Well, just wait till the lights go out. I think Ian's practicing for. I seriously doubt whether we'll get through the winter because they're blowing up our last coal-fired power station, and the grid does not have enough power from these idiotic bloody turbines to run the grid through the winter. If the interlinkers go through, go down from France, where we'll get our power on to keep us going, then our lights are going out. Not only the lights are any reasonable size now, so it's going to get very funny.
Thank you, Lucian. And I think at that point, I shall of a great deal of thanks to you and Julian for managing the slides, etc. That was remarkable. I think we all get some appreciation of the intense complexity of all this, and the interdisciplinarity of it all, from microbiology, chemistry, physics, economics, social sciences, etc. It is all an amazing amalgam of issues and problems to deal with. So I think we ought to sort of make this as part of the Institute's mission, is to sort of work with this and try to get people to understand that complexity and see if we can get some of the solutions that you're talking about at least up the agenda, if not properly implemented. That would be an ideal.
And I think Lucian's got some of his books left if people are interested. Sorry, the camera's not picking it up very well, but yeah, there we are.
We should promote that and
I keep losing it.
Yeah.
Look forward to what we can do next. So thank you, everybody, and see you again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Oh, indeed, Lucian, brilliant.
Thanks. Bye. Come on. Bye for now. Bye-bye.
Good. Just make up that one. Who's that from? Paul.